Rhett, I know recently on a podcast you mentioned that your marriage has kind of hit like this second wind, right? Is there kind of a trick to a kind of a long marriage? Because I've been with Lindsay 13 years. We've been married now for, is it 4 or 5-ish? General window. Is it just communication? Is there something else?
There are tricks, but I can't demonstrate them here.
Oh no!
You're talking about
sexual tricks.
That's it's
no. Well, I do think that
sex is a thermometer.
I think the
not a thermostat.
Sexual tricks being slowly discovered and unleashed over the course of your marriage is one thing. But that's not why we're still married. But I do.
But
think
it doesn't hurt.
You don't want to do all the tricks
all at once
early on.
Yeah,
you're gonna run out of tricks real fast.
I mean, my bag. I didn't even have a bag at the beginning to put tricks in.
Oh, I was like, well, bag what?
So some of the best sex tricks involve a bag. You don't. I'll talk to you about it later.
Yeah. So that specifically, the second wind. I kind of talked about that in the context of a recent episode of our podcast, Ear Biscuits, where Link and I both kind of shared our long backstory and specifically kind of growing up as evangelical Christians and then kind of transitioning out of that as we, like over the past decade and a half or so. And so that's very much my wife's background as well. And so I think that the second wind kind of came when there was a pretty long period of time in this, what we kind of call the deconstruction process, when we were kind of like basically taking the orienting principle of our entire lives and just sort of saying, we don't believe this anymore. We thought that the only reason, this is an oversimplification, but we thought that the main reason that we were married and had a good marriage and had a hopeful marriage was just based on this particular worldview that we had, right? And then when you kind of abandon that worldview, then you're like, well, what do we have now? We just have like love, and I think that there was sort of a rediscovery of each other in that process when we realized that, like, oh yeah, this is obviously there is a commitment involved, but it isn't something that like, oh, you're only staying married because you fear God's judgment or something like that. Mm-hmm. No, you're actually compelled to stay together because you keep discovering new things about one another, besides just the sexual tricks. And so I think that, and that doesn't always happen, because I think in a lot of deconstructions, and we know this from many stories that we've heard and stories that people have even shared over the past couple of weeks, it's like, a lot of times people don't come along for that. They're like, no, that's not, and it isn't like I was like, hey, you got to do this. It was very much just like, here's what's happening to me. And then Jessie has her own particular story and reasons that are very different than mine, that where she got to where she's at. But I think it was kind of like being in a club together and feeling like your association with this person is kind of based on your membership in this club. And then you both sort of leave the club and then rediscover each other, and we're like, oh, actually, no, because we love each other. So I think that, yeah, the past few years, I think, have been the best years of our marriage for sure.
Do you feel like it was incredibly hard because were you the first person to kind of express doubts or kind of walk through that door, if we call it that?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
What was kind of, how long did you, if you're comfortable talking about it, how long did you kind of have to think about it? And what was like the moment where you're like, okay, this is it?
I knew that it was going to be a very, very sensitive subject, but I didn't wait too long. I mean, I have a friend who basically completely deconstructed before he ever let his wife know anything, because he was so frightened at what it might do, which I totally get that and relate to that. But for me, it was like, I'm going to bring something up, which is something that I actually was thinking about 6 months ago. I'm actually already in a different place now, but maybe I should, before I get too far along in this process, maybe I should just say, what do you think about this? And And virtually every time that I would ask a difficult question, which, you know, she's very intelligent and intelligent enough to know, oh, I see where this is going. And so basically it would always result in her like kind of breaking down.
Okay.
And crying. But she wasn't mad, and she didn't judge me, and she might push back a little bit, but we would just kind of continue to talk about things. And then after a while, I think she would kind of be like, okay, I'm kind of I'm in the same place on this particular thing. And it kind of just slowly unfolded. And then after a while, she was just, at that point, once she had sort of like lost the fear of being introspective about her faith, in the way that I was, she took her own path and kind of had her own process.
Because I was gonna say, like I can't imagine how scary that would be. Not only because there are the stories of it not panning out or working out, but I've had to kind of calm myself down, because I think after listening to both of your podcasts talking about everything you went through, and then seeing some of the reactions, in general, very positive, but I imagine the ones that stand out are people saying things like disappointed, or those things that you pre-plan for, and then you see it and it sucks. Like it's not to minimize anything else. I'm sure it's like the closest thing like a straight white guy can feel towards like a coming out of some sort. You know?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely started to realize I was able to empathize with, you know, people who came out of a sexual closet.
Sure.
Because it was a religious closet, and it was, okay, we're breaking this news. This has been something that's been a part of who I am for years, but I've resisted the urge to talk about it, or I haven't. There's never seems to be the right time to talk about it. And again, it's different in that it wasn't. It was I don't know how different it was, but it was a process, you know, over many years, and it wasn't just me realizing, oh, I'm gay. This is a part of who I am. It's more of my worldview is morphing. It's evolving. It's, you know, so it is different. But at the moment that you do decide to share it, and you're revealing a lot, I'm like, okay, now everyone has to have their take on it. And even the people who they think they're being helpful or caring, but they just don't see how there's something baked into their response that is even hurtful. You know, I started to think about people's coming out stories and starting to relate at least a little bit. And I mean, it's just one of the many positive ripple effects of sharing our stories, was just being able to empathize more with other people, even if it's a totally different story about something totally different, to say, okay, you especially on the internet, you put yourself out there, and it's like, I didn't know it was going to feel like that.
Are you talking about specifically with family, or your wife and your family and friends, or
no?
After this video,
I'm talking about I'm talking about the public reaction. I mean, with Christy and with the kids, it was something that we were having ongoing conversations over the past 10 years. And so it was fans, strangers, people who care about the issues but don't know us and have never consumed any of our content, now coming out of their woodwork to give their hot take on what we shared, was something that I guess we anticipated that happening, but I don't know how much you can really prepare for it.
Yeah, I tried to. Well, I think when I sort of told my story, I was telling it in a way that I would have wanted to have heard it 10 years ago as myself, right? Like something that would have made sense to me 10 years ago. And so I tried to, because we being in that community, we've had friends deconstruct, and we actually talk a little bit about this on our podcast with one of our good friends, who he basically sort of straying from a very traditional faith, and we tried to sort of get to the bottom of it and figure out, well, what did he do wrong? Not does he have any good points. It was more like, what's wrong with him and his process and his motivations that led him to this place. And because I knew that was what was going to happen with us, I was very careful to say some things that I knew would be common accusations, right? I was very clear to say that, okay, I know what people are going to think. They're going to think that you guys moved to Los Angeles and you lost your faith. Big surprise. Happens all the time. Tried to be very clear about the fact that this process had started and almost completely finished when I was in North Carolina, still completely embedded in a Christian community, still leading a Bible study at my church. You know what I'm saying? And still the deconstruction had basically happened. So kind of made that clear. But that it doesn't really matter because we're still getting lots of people saying that. And so you kind of just like, I think a lot of the comments, and I remember this feeling this way, or kind of now looking back in retrospect to the way that we treated people who sort of deconstructed or left the faith. What we had to say to them was a lot more about our own fear and our own insecurity. In fact, I haven't even told you this story, but we've got a good friend who had sort of a public deconstruction, and somebody wrote one of these sort of like Christian hit pieces on him to kind of basically try to find where he went wrong and what was wrong with his motivations and his process and his heart that led him to this place. And then after the article came out, he got a direct message from the dude who wrote the article, who was basically like, "Hey man, I'm actually a big fan of yours and I don't believe this anymore either."
What? But he wrote the hit piece?
Yes. And so it's you know what? It's not surprising at all. It's not surprising at all because in so many of the critical, sort of dismissive and judgmental responses that I see, I can actually see my former self in those, struggling and trying to talk to myself to try to justify where I'm at. And I think that my wife made a really good point when we were talking about this. She was like, if something is true, does it really need to be defended with a passion and with an intensity? Do you need to make sure, we got to teach our kids to be ready for all this, and this, and this. We got to prepare everybody. It's like, if something is true, it should be able to withstand, investigation and inquiry, Mm-hmm. And I think that, I think a lot of people are just kind of speaking out of their own fears and insecurities. But I totally get it because that's
where we were.
That's where we were. And that's where I continue to be as a human, right? I want to justify myself now and where I'm at now. I want to defend the things that I think now. And a lot of that comes from my own fears and insecurities. You don't get rid of that.
But the stakes associated with what we believe now is not the same as what it was then.
Yeah.
If the stakes are eternal salvation or damnation, and then you think about, okay, we got to protect our kids, and I get that because we were in that place, and there is a level of intensity that I aspire to shed now.
Well, I don't have the ability to be that intense about what I believe now, because if you're like, I'm not going to die on the hill
defined
of, because I don't. I'm no longer certain about things about which I don't think I can be certain about.